This is what freedom sounds like, how Wagner weaves nature into the motive of the Sword of Liberty. The opening of Das Rheingold symbolizes, if you like, the mythical origin of all life, the process of becoming and growing. As a layman, one wonders, how does Mr. Wagner actually incorporate this, shall we say, act of procreation into the orchestra without immediately causing a commotion in the stalls? What does such a paradisiacal primal state sound like? That is, before Lady Eve bit into the apple and Mr. Adam complained of his first bout of lumbago. And how, pray tell, does he derive the principle of freedom from this? Highly intriguing connections, as we shall see. For once again, we're delving into the subtle mysteries of musical psychology. In the beginning, the world is quite all right. Nature is still untouched, something that is hardly to be found today, and the water in the Rhine is remarkably clear, though we can only surmise this, for we are in the opera's prelude and the curtain is generally still closed at this point. Yet in our imagination music awakens nature. Indeed, it practically creates it. But how does one compose the creation of the world? Wagner does this by letting a triad, the bedrock of music, resound. At the very lower end of the audible spectrum, the double basses begin with a soft hum on a note so low that one essentially feels it in one's stomach rather than hears it. Then the fifth joins in around this point. But for a triad, a third is required. Minor third would result in a minor triad, a major third in a major triad. Wagner leaves it open for 12 bars before the major third finally resolves the mystery. Here comes the major third, and thus the major triad is born, the very seed of music, so to speak. Then movement enters the music. Growth emerges from the triad. Nature strives upwards in great strides and in small steps. The wave motif joins in with its rising and falling. After all, we're in the waters of the Rhine. These are the original nature motifs, all in a cheerful major key. The Rhine maidens splash about in the water with complete abandon, delighting in a gleaming lump of precious metal. Until a certain Mr. Alberich turns up, who makes every effort to charm the young ladies, but unfortunately receives no response worth mentioning. Now the gold is struck by a ray of sunlight, and in an instant all the lighting in the living room becomes superfluous. The Rheingold Fanfare is also a nature motive. It symbolizes the sunlight shining on the Rhine's gold and making it glow. It features almost the same notes as the nature motive, only with a slightly crisper rhythm. Having been rebuffed several times by the Rhine maidens, Alberich's interest has considerably shifted to the gold through this natural spectacle, and so he promptly resorts to extreme measures. He steals the gold and forges it into a piece of jewelry with a built-in guarantee of power. Not very refined, but very effective. Father of the gods, Wotan, on the other hand, is in dire financial straits, having had 2 giants build him a rather costly fortress called Valhalla. So he steals the ring and the gold from Alberich. After all, he has to pay the craftsman somehow. He's quite happy to leave the gold to the giants, but prefers to keep the ring for himself. Absolute power has a certain appeal. Yet the giants flatly refuse to leave the area without the ring, a classic stalemate in the divine building trade. At that moment the ground opens up and a mature but rather attractive lady named Erda enters the scene. Musically, Erda shows signs of grief and depression in the face of the influence that power has gained over dwarves and gods. She is nature personified, but appears in a minor key due to her somber state of mind. Here is the nature motif in a major key. And now Erda motif in a minor key. Erda prophesies Wotan's downfall, and Wagner logically composes this as a reversal of the Erda motif. First you hear the Erda motif, then the Twilight of the Gods motif. Wotan, not entirely resistant to good advice, parts with the ring with a heavy heart and leaves it to the giants. Promptly a brawl breaks out among the giants with fatal consequences for one of the brothers. The surviving giant, Mr. Fafner, leaves the scene with the entire spoils. Wotan realizes with crystal clarity this ring harbors a certain potential for conflict. Since he himself is not allowed to retrieve the ring himself, purely for contractual reasons that would only lead to significant trouble with the legal department, he needs a freelancer. A hero, unbound, energetic and ready to return the stolen ring to the Rhine maidens on his own account. And what does a freelance hero like that need? Of course, that's right, an exclusive tool of the trade, the Sword of Freedom. The motif of the Sword of Freedom begins with an ascending note similar to the nature motifs, yet nature has been violated by the lust for power of Wotan and Alberich, so it descends a whole octave. Then, however, freedom triumphs. The nature motif bursts out of the pit of the octave fall and reaches its radiant conclusion. This outburst corresponds exactly to the nature motif, yet like the Rheingold fanfare with a slightly crisper rhythm. A stroke of musical genius. The nature motif is rather comfortable. It strives upwards as if it was the only logical direction. Freedom, on the other hand, is a feat of strength. As a hero, one must first climb out of the pit of the falling octave. So, what do we learn from this? Power, money, and influence on the one hand, and nature, light and freedom on the other, are thus absolute opposites in Wagner's music. For him, nature signifies freedom, whereas the power of the individual signifies bondage for all those subject to it. And so the nature motifs the Erda motif, the Twilight of the Gods motif, and finally the Sword motif are all interconnected. Once again, quite a coherent concept. Richard Wagner simply wouldn't settle for anything less. So much for the nature, light and freedom motifs. In the next video we'll take a closer look at the chromatic motifs. Chromatic music departs from the traditional scales. With the chromatic music in Tristan and Isolde, Wagner finally pushed open the door to modern music. He had, however, already laid the groundwork for this in the Ring, and we'll examine that in detail in the next video. I can promise, it remains exciting. Until then, auf Wiedersehen and ciao.